The heavy autumn rain battered the tall glass windows of the 35th floor of the premier financial tower in downtown Seattle, Washington. Richard Valmont, a man whose name was synonymous with industrial real estate power throughout the Pacific Northwest, sat at his mahogany desk with trembling hands. He was staring intensely at a private financial audit that threatened to shatter his long-held corporate peace. The cold, hard data layout on the high-grade paper left no room for alternative interpretations. For several consecutive months, premium, specialized industrial cleaning chemicals and high-end maintenance equipment had been systematically vanishing from the central corporate inventory log. Every piece of logic pointed directly toward the night maintenance staff, a reality that cut Richard deeply because he had always prided himself on treating his workforce like an extended family. He rubbed his temples, staring out into the misty, rain-slicked city streets, trying to find a reason to doubt the evidence before him. He had built Valmont Industries on a foundation of absolute loyalty, paying wages well above the local average and offering comprehensive health benefits that were rare in the service sector. To think that someone within his inner sanctuary was betraying that trust felt like a physical blow to his chest. The preliminary report from the private intelligence firm he had quietly retained sat next to the financial spreadsheets, complete with blurry night vision, still showing an obscured figure moving large crates out through the loading dock well past midnight. Richard felt a profound sense of isolation looking at those images. He had spent his entire adult life equating financial abundance with security, believing that if you paid people well, you secured their honesty. Now, that foundational philosophy was crumbling, leaving him with a bitter taste of disillusionment that no amount of corporate success could sweeten. As the corporate clock neared 9 o'clock in the evening, the bustling sounds of the daytime executives faded completely, replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the building's industrial vacuum cleaners. Richard turned off his office lamps, letting the ambient neon glow from the Seattle skyline cast long, sharp shadows across his desk. He sat in total stillness, watching through the narrow vertical glass panel of his heavy office door as the night shift commenced. Soon enough, a familiar figure entered the executive suite. It was Evelyn Morris, a quiet, meticulously thorough woman in her late 40s, who had taken care of Richard's personal office for over 3 consecutive years. Evelyn was a ghost in the corporate machine, always working with a silent efficiency, never complaining, and always offering a polite, respectful nod whenever their paths crossed during late-night strategy sessions. Richard watched her move with an aching heart as she wiped down the conference tables and dusted the bookshelves with the same careful reverence she had shown since her first day on the job. Every movement was precise, an art form of domestic labor that had earned his highest regard. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Evelyn paused, looked down both sides of the empty, dimly lit hallway, and pulled a heavy brass master key from her apron pocket. A key that Richard knew had never been officially assigned to her department. She unlocked the heavy steel door of the primary chemical repository, stepping inside for several long minutes before emerging with a large, heavy industrial canvas bag. Through his hidden vantage point, Richard saw the unmistakable shapes of premium concentrated medical grade, disinfectants, and specialized air purifying solutions filling the container to its absolute brim. The reality of the theft hit Richard like a wave of freezing water, instantly solidifying his worst corporate fears into an undeniable truth. He leaned back against his office wall, closing his eyes as a mixture of sharp anger and profound disappointment washed over him. Why would Evelyn, a woman who received a steady, fair paycheck and an annual winter bonus, risk her entire livelihood and criminal record for a collection of industrial cleaning supplies? It made no logical sense. If she needed extra money, she could have simply asked for a corporate advance, a gesture Richard had granted to dozens of employees over the decades. He watched her carry the heavy bag toward the service elevators, her spine bending under the immense physical weight of the stolen goods, looking entirely unlike a seasoned criminal and more like a woman carrying a crushing burden. Instead of picking up the phone to alert the building's private security team or calling the local precinct, Richard found himself driven by an intense, burning need to comprehend the underlying motive behind the crime. He grabbed his heavy wool overcoat, slipped out through the executive back exit, and descended to the underground parking garage via the private express elevator. He started his dark Mercedes sedan, keeping the headlights turned off until he saw Evelyn exit the building's employee portal on foot, her canvas bag slung heavily over her right shoulder. She walked through the cold rain toward the nearby public transit line, entirely unaware that her employer was tracking her every move from a discreet distance across the slick, wet asphalt of the city streets. The old municipal bus roared to life, expelling a thick cloud of exhaust into the damp night air as it began its long, winding journey away from the affluent corporate center of Seattle. Richard followed the transit vehicle from a safe distance of 2 blocks, his luxury vehicle feeling entirely out of place as the gleaming skyscrapers gradually gave way to industrial warehouses and eventually to the forgotten, low-income outskirts of the metropolitan area. The streetlights here were spaced far apart, many of them flickering rhythmically or entirely dark, casting the broken asphalt below into deep, unwelcoming shadows. This was a sector of the region Richard had never seen from his high-rise office, a place where the economic prosperity of the city seemed to completely vanish into thin air. After nearly 45 minutes of continuous driving, the bus pulled over at a gravel stop near the edge of an old, neglected industrial tract. Evelyn stepped down into the downpour, adjusting the heavy canvas strap on her shoulder before veering off onto an unpaved mud road that led toward a dense thicket of trees. Richard parked his vehicle under the shadow of an abandoned shipping container, stepping out into the freezing rain to follow her on foot. He pulled his collar up, keeping low against the rusted chain-link fences that lined the path, his leather shoes sinking deep into the thick, freezing mud with every step he took. The anger that had fueled his initial pursuit was slowly being replaced by a strange, hollow knot of apprehension in his stomach. Evelyn walked with a hurried, desperate urgency now, her breath visible in the cold air as she carried the heavy cargo deeper into the forgotten district. Richard tracked her for another 10 minutes until she finally came to a halt in front of a structure that made him completely freeze in his tracks. It was not a residential home, nor was it a functional apartment building. It was a long-abandoned timber-framing mill that had been partially destroyed by a historic fire decades ago. The wooden beams were charred and deeply cracked. The upper windows were completely shattered and boarded up with rotting pieces of industrial, cardboard, and a large section of the corrugated tin roof sagged dangerously toward the center of the foundation. The structure looked entirely uninhabitable, a safety hazard that any city inspector would have ordered demolished immediately. Yet, Evelyn pulled open a rusted side metal door with practiced familiarity and stepped into the dark interior, closing the entrance behind her. Richard stood in the pouring rain for several long moments, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the image of this dilapidated ruin with the concept of a sophisticated corporate theft ring. This was clearly not a warehouse for a black market fencing operation. He crept forward with extreme caution, his heart thumping loudly against his ribs as he reached the side of the building, carefully avoiding the broken glass and rusted iron nails scattered across the overgrown ground. He pressed his back against the damp, charred wood of the exterior wall, holding his breath as he listened for any sounds filtering through the cracks in the structure. The heavy patter of the rain on the tin roof threatened to drown everything out, but as he moved closer to a window opening covered by a thick sheet of weathered plastic, he heard distinct human voices originating from within the darkness. They were not the gruff, whispered tones of criminal conspirators dividing stolen loot. They were the unmistakable soft voices of young children, their words carrying an undercurrent of vulnerability that made Richard's breath catch completely in his throat. "Mom, you're finally home," a young boy's voice echoed softly through the drafty interior of the old mill, his tone filled with an immediate sense of relief. David's cough got much worse after the sun went down, and Sarah's forehead feels like it's on fire again. Richard felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest, as if all the oxygen had been instantly removed from the surrounding atmosphere. He leaned closer to the window, finding a small, torn opening in the plastic sheeting that allowed him to peer directly into the center of the abandoned structure. The interior was illuminated only by a few thick wax candles placed carefully on rusted metal barrels, casting long, dancing shadows across the cracked concrete floor. What Richard witnessed through that tiny opening completely shattered every preconceived notion he had carried about Evelyn Morris. In the center of the vast, cold space, Evelyn had set up a small, improvised living area partitioned off by old canvas tarps. 3 children were huddled together on a couple of stained, threadbare mattresses laid directly on the floor. A teenage boy, who appeared to be no older than 14, was holding a younger boy of about 5, while a little girl of roughly 8 years old sat shivering under a pile of coarse woolen blankets. Evelyn had already opened her large canvas bag and was currently kneeling on the cold concrete, working with a frantic, metered energy. She was pouring the stolen industrial disinfectant into an old plastic bucket, mixing it with water she had apparently brought in jugs, and began scrubbing the wooden pallets and concrete surfaces surrounding the children's sleeping area. She moved with the exact same meticulous precision Richard had witnessed in his executive suite. But now, the labor was infused with a desperate, protective maternal love. "Hold on, my sweet boy," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as she reached out to touch the youngest boy's cheek. "Mom brought the strong medicine for the air. We're going to clean away all the dampness and the mold. I won't let this place take you away from me, too." Richard stumbled backward into the darkness, his boots splashing into a puddle of water as tears began to stream down his face, completely unbidden. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn wasn't stealing these high-end chemical supplies to sell them for a profit on the street. She was using them in a desperate daily battle against the toxic mold, dampness, and rot of an abandoned building, trying to create a sterile, safe environment to keep her sick children alive in a place where no human being should ever have to live. He felt a profound wave of shame wash over him, as he remembered the anger and suspicion he had harbored over a few $100s worth of corporate inventory. "Mom," the little girl Sarah asked in a fragile, trembling voice that pierced through the cold night air like a knife, "is Dad ever going to come back from the stars to help us? He promised he would always take care of us before he had to go away." The heavy silence that followed her question inside the mill was far more devastating than any cry of anguish. Richard stood paralyzed in the rain, watching through the tear in the plastic as Evelyn stopped her scrubbing, her shoulders shaking violently as she pulled her children into a tight, protective embrace. She was fighting an epic war against absolute poverty, systemic neglect, and profound personal grief all at once, while he had spent his week worrying about profit margins. Richard returned to his luxury vehicle with a completely broken spirit, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his keys onto the muddy ground twice before managing to unlock the door. He sat in the driver's seat, staring out through the rain-streaked windshield at the distant, dim light flickering within the abandoned mill. The innocent question of the little girl kept repeating in his mind like a painful echo. He looked at the leather interior of his vehicle, the digital dashboard glowing with expensive precision, and felt a sudden intense revulsion toward his own immense wealth. How had he remained so completely blind to the agonizing reality of a woman who had cleaned his personal workspace every single night for 3 years? He realized then that every extra hour Evelyn had volunteered to work at the office wasn't an attempt to secure overtime pay out of greed. It was a desperate bid to remain within a warm, safe building while earning every scrap of resource possible to feed the 3 souls waiting for her in the cold. Suddenly, a sharp commotion from within the mill broke through the sound of the storm. Richard immediately exited his car once more, drawn back to the window by an instinct he didn't fully comprehend. Through the opening he saw the teenage boy, Michael, shouting in terror as the youngest child, David, began to gasp violently for air, his tiny chest heaving with an unnatural, terrifying rhythm. "Mom, David can't breathe at all," Michael cried out, his hands hovering over his little brother in a state of absolute panic. "His lips are turning blue, and he's making that horrible rattling sound again." Evelyn acted instantly, lifting the small boy into her arms while directing her older children with a voice that shook with terror, but remained steady with maternal command. "Michael, get the old metal pot and pour the boiling water over the eucalyptus leaves right now. Sarah, help me hold his head up so he can inhale the steam. We can do this, babies. Stay strong for Mom. Richard watched in absolute fascination and horror as the impoverished family mobilized an improvised medical intervention using nothing but an old camp stove, a dented aluminum pot, and a few herbal remedies. Michael carefully balanced the steaming container near his little brother's face, creating a makeshift vapor tent out of an old towel, while Sarah gently rubbed the toddler's back. The absolute coordination between the siblings spoke of a terrible, well-established routine, a survival mechanism born of absolute necessity among children who had been forced to grow up far too fast in a world that had completely forgotten them. "Why does David always get so sick here, Mom?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes wide with a brutal childhood honesty that broke Richard's heart. "Is it because we don't have the big heaters like the ones at my school? Is it because the walls are always wet?" Evelyn tried desperately to blink away her tears as she adjusted the towel over her son's head. "The world is just testing us right now, my love," she replied, her voice thick with unspeakable sorrow. "But as long as we hold on to each other, we have a home. Your Father is watching over us from heaven, and He gives us the strength to endure anything." "Mom," Michael said with a quiet, heartbreaking resolve, as the youngest boy's breathing finally began to ease slightly under the influence of the steam. "I'm not going to my freshman classes tomorrow. I can stay here and watch David and Sarah while you go to the office. I heard from one of the guys down at the shipping docks that they need extra hands to unload the morning freight crates. I can earn $40 a day to help with the grocery bills." Evelyn stopped what she was doing, reaching out to cup her oldest son's face with a look of intense pride and fierce resistance. "Absolutely not, Michael. Your education is the only path out of this life. Your father sacrificed everything for us to have a future, and I will not let poverty steal your mind." "But, Mom, we need the money for real medicine," Michael countered, his young voice carrying the heavy weight of an adult provider. "If David gets another fever like this next week, we can't just rely on an old pot of water. Someone has to earn something extra, and you can't afford to lose your job at Valmont Industries. If you miss even one night of work, they'll replace you within 24 hours. Richard leaned his forehead against the cold exterior wall of the building, the metal freezing his skin as the words sank into his consciousness. He was the employer they feared. His corporate policies were the invisible sword hanging over this mother's head, forcing her to choose between the physical survival of her children and the maintenance of her meager livelihood. Evelyn pulled all three of her children into a tight, singular embrace on the mattress, her voice falling into a low whisper that Richard could barely catch through the whistling wind. "Listen to me, all of you. I know it's freezing right now. I know there isn't enough food in the pantry for a full week, and I know you are terrified. But I promise you, on my life, that this is temporary. I am working every single hour I can to get us an actual apartment with proper insulation and running water. Just hold on to hope for a little bit longer." "Are we really going to have a house with a real kitchen again, Mom?" Sarah asked, her small face lighting up with a desperate, beautiful innocence. "Where David won't have to cough every time it rains." Evelyn nodded against her daughter's hair, but Richard could see the profound uncertainty and despair written across her features. On a night cleaner's salary in a city with an exploding cost of living like Seattle, the dream of securing a safe, mold-free residential apartment was an mathematical impossibility, no matter how many hours of overtime she volunteered to complete. "Michael," Evelyn whispered softly after the two younger children had finally closed their eyes, believing her promises. "There is something I need to tell you about my work at the tower. Lately, I've had to take things from the corporate supply closet, the high-grade disinfectants, and the specialized air scrubbers. I know it is fundamentally wrong to take what doesn't belong to us, but with David's lungs in this condition, I didn't see any other way to keep the air in this place from hurting him." Michael squeezed his mother's hand tightly. "You don't have to explain anything to me, Mom. Dad always said that a parent does whatever it takes to protect the family. You aren't a criminal. You're just saving us." "But it matters, Michael," Evelyn insisted, tears flowing freely down her worn cheeks. "I don't want you or your siblings to think that dishonesty is acceptable just because life is difficult. Your father was an honest, hard-working man who valued integrity above all things. What I am doing right now is a sin born of absolute desperation, and I pray every night that God forgives me for it." Richard had to grip the edge of the window frame to keep his balance as a profound wave of spiritual vertigo hit him. This woman, living in the ruins of an old mill, was demonstrating a higher level of moral clarity and ethical torment, over a few bottles of cleaning solution, than most of the corporate executives he interacted with on a daily basis. Suddenly, young David began to convulse violently, his tiny body stiffening as a harsh, choked sound rattled from his throat. The improvised vapor treatment had failed, and the child was now completely deprived of oxygen. Evelyn screamed in pure terror, lifting the rigid toddler into her arms as Michael and Sarah scrambled off the mattress in a panic. "He's having an oxygen crisis, Michael. We have to get him to an emergency room right now." "Grab the blankets," Evelyn cried out, her maternal strength overriding her physical exhaustion as she wrapped the boy and ran toward the door. Richard didn't hesitate for another second. He abandoned his hiding place in the shadows and ran full speed through the mud toward his parked Mercedes, starting the engine and throwing the car into reverse just as Evelyn emerged from the tree line with her children trailing behind her in the dark downpour. He swung the passenger door open, the bright interior lights illuminating the mud and rain. "Evelyn, get in the car right now," he shouted over the roar of the engine. Evelyn froze in absolute shock, her eyes widening in terror as she recognized the face of her billionaire employer staring back at her from the luxury vehicle. "Mr. Valmont?" she stammered, her body trembling as she held her gasping son tightly against her chest. What are you doing here?" Richard stepped out into the pouring rain, ignoring the water ruining his expensive suit as he gently but firmly guided her toward the warm interior of the vehicle. "There is no time to explain, Evelyn. Your son needs a hospital immediately. Get inside, all of you." Michael and Sarah scrambled into the leather back seats, followed by Evelyn, who was weeping with a mixture of intense confusion and raw survival instinct, as Richard accelerated down the gravel road toward the highway. He pushed the luxury sedan to its absolute limits, weaving through the late-night traffic with his hazard lights flashing, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror to check on the small boy who was drifting in and out of consciousness in his mother's arms. The interior of the car was completely silent except for the ragged, painful gasps of the child and the soft, terrified whimpers of Sarah. Richard gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, realizing that the entire trajectory of his life had just narrowed down to a single, desperate race against time to save the life of a child he hadn't even known existed an hour prior. They arrived at Harborview Medical Center within 15 minutes, the bright emergency lights casting a sterile, clinical glare over the wet pavement. Richard left his car parked squarely in the ambulance bay, running ahead to open the heavy glass doors as Evelyn sprinted inside with David held tightly in her arms. The emergency waiting room was a chaotic scene of late-night metropolitan trauma, filled with the low drone of television monitors and the heavy sighs of exhausted patients waiting for care. Evelyn ran directly to the primary triage desk, her voice rising in a desperate plea that commanded the attention of the room. "Please, my son can't breathe," she cried out to the intake nurse behind the bulletproof glass counter. "He has a severe respiratory condition, and his lips are turning blue. Please, someone help him." The nurse looked up from her computer terminal, her expression professional but heavily weathered by years of systemic overcrowding. She glanced at the gasping child and immediately pulled a stack of heavy clipboard documents from a slot on the wall. "Madam, I understand this is an emergency, but I need you to fill out these intake forms first. We need a verified home address, insurance provider details, and a primary method of payment before we can input him into the active treatment queue." "He is suffocating right now," Evelyn shouted, her pride completely vanishing as she slammed her hand against the counter in sheer desperation. "Take him into the back first, and I will sign whatever papers you want after he is safe. Please, I beg of you." The nurse shook her head with a rigid institutional coldness. "I cannot generate an emergency room tracking number without a valid residential address, ma'am. It's hospital policy for legal and billing tracking. If you don't fill out the paperwork, The doctors cannot legally assume care unless it's an active cardiac arrest. Evelyn grabbed the pen with a shaking hand, staring down at the blank line marked residential address. She froze completely, a look of profound humiliation crossing her face. If she wrote down the abandoned mill, the hospital staff would immediately flag her for child neglect, and social services would take her children away. While she hesitated, young David's body suddenly went completely rigid, his eyes rolling back into his head as he entered a severe febrile convulsion brought on by the prolonged lack of oxygen. Evelyn let out a primal scream of pure maternal agony that shattered the bureaucratic monotony of the clinic. Richard stepped forward instantly, shoving his platinum corporate security card and personal driver's license onto the counter directly over the incomplete forms. "His address is my residential property in Madison Park," Richard stated with an absolute, unyielding authority that caused the intake nurse to freeze. "My name is Richard Valmont, CEO of Valmont Industries. I am personally guaranteeing absolute financial responsibility for every single cent of this child's medical care. Call the Chief of Pediatrics to the floor immediately, or I will purchase this entire medical facility by morning and terminate your employment before sunrise." The institutional wall of bureaucracy dissolved instantly under the immense pressure of absolute financial power. Within 30 seconds, a team of emergency physicians and respiratory therapists materialized through the double doors, snatching young David from Evelyn's arms and wheeling him into the trauma bay under a frantic Code Blue announcement. Evelyn collapsed onto her knees right there on the sterile linoleum floor, her hands reaching out toward the doors that had just closed her son away from her. Michael and Sarah immediately threw themselves onto the floor beside her, wrapping their small arms around their mother as she wept with a shattering intensity. Richard stood over them, his long shadow covering the broken family, as he watched the grand executive cleaner of his tower completely fall apart under the weight of a cruel, unfeeling system. He looked down at his own expensive leather shoes, now covered in the mud of the abandoned mill, and realized that his wealth had never been more useful than it was in this exact second. Yet he had never felt more spiritually bankrupt. He reached down, gently placing his hands under Evelyn's shoulders to guide her up into one of the plastic waiting room chairs, sitting directly across from her so she could not look away from his gaze. "Evelyn," Richard said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent a lifetime suppressing in the name of corporate stoicism. "I need you to look at me. I am not here to fire you, and I am certainly not here to call the police. I followed you tonight because I was blind, arrogant, and suspicious. But what I witnessed in that old mill tonight, it has completely rewritten everything I thought I knew about dignity, love, and what it means to be a human being." Evelyn wiped her eyes, looking at him with a profound vulnerability. "You saw how we live, Mr. Valmont. You saw my shame. You saw that I failed to give my children a real life." "You have not failed anyone, Evelyn," Richard replied firmly, his eyes shining with genuine tears. "You are running an empire of survival on a servant's wage, and you are doing it with the heart of a warrior. I am the one who has failed. I have sat in my ivory tower, looking down at profit charts, while the very people who keep my physical world clean are fighting a daily battle against death itself. I am so deeply sorry for my ignorance." Michael looked up at Richard, his young face hardened by months of cold nights. "Are you going to make us leave the mill? We don't have anywhere else to go." "No, son," Richard said, reaching out to place a respectful hand on the teenager's shoulder. "You are never going back to that freezing mill again. From this moment onward, your family is under my personal protection. But before we discuss the future, there is a question that is tearing my soul apart. Evelyn, how did a family with so much love and structure end up living in the ruins of a burnt-out industrial plant? What happened to your husband?" Evelyn let out a long, ragged breath, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling as she prepared to open a wound that had never truly healed. "My husband's name was Arthur," Evelyn began, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, melancholic tone that held the entire room captive. "He was a master structural welder, one of the best in the entire state of Washington. He spent his life working on the iron skeletons of the very high-rises that define the skyline of this city. He loved his work, and he loved these children more than life itself. He used to come home covered in soot and iron dust, but before he would even wash his hands, he would pull all three of them into a massive embrace, telling them that they were his reason for reaching toward the sky every day. "What happened to him, Mom?" Sarah whispered, leaning her head against her mother's arm, though she already knew the tragic narrative by heart. "He was working on the construction of the new Vanguard corporate plaza downtown 4 years ago," Evelyn continued, her eyes locking directly onto Richard's face with a sudden, devastating intensity. "The main development firm was under massive pressure to finish the project ahead of the winter freeze. To save time and cut operational costs, they didn't replace the worn safety cables on the upper scaffolding units. They forced the crews to work through a severe windstorm without proper secondary harness lines." Richard felt the blood completely drain from his face, a cold dread twisting inside his stomach as the name of the project registered in his mind. Valmont Real Estate Development had been the primary general contractor for the Vanguard corporate plaza. It was the very project that had secured his billionaire status and solidified his dominance in the regional market. The primary weld platform collapsed from the 19th floor during a 60-mile-per-hour gust, Evelyn whispered, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. "Arthur fell to his death because the safety clips were rusted through. When I tried to seek a corporate settlement to pay for his burial and keep our home, the company's high-priced legal team buried me in paperwork, claiming Arthur had signed a safety waiver and that the accident was entirely due to his own personal negligence." The revelation struck Richard like a physical blow, leaving him completely breathless in his chair. The corporate apparatus he had constructed to protect his wealth had actively destroyed this family, stripping them of their provider, denying them legal justice, and casting them into the outer darkness of absolute poverty. Evelyn had applied for the night cleaning position at his corporate headquarters not out of coincidence, but out of a quiet, profound act of survival. Working in the very office of the man whose corporate greed had cost her husband his life, just to earn the scraps needed to keep his children from starving. "You knew exactly who I was," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with an agonizing sense of guilt. "Every single night you cleaned my desk, looked at my family photographs, and emptied my trash. You knew I was the man responsible for the destruction of your world." Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression entirely devoid of malice, carrying only a profound, exhausted peace. "I knew who you were, Mr. Valmont. But anger doesn't pay for bread, and hatred doesn't keep my children warm. Arthur always taught our boys that real strength is found in endurance, not in vengeance. I didn't want your money. I just needed a job to keep my family alive." The chief pediatrician emerged from the double doors of the intensive care unit, just as the first morning light began to break through the clouds, his expression carrying a reassuring calm that instantly broke the agonizing tension in the waiting area. "Mrs. Morris," the doctor announced, walking toward them with a warm smile. "The emergency intubation was completely successful, and we've managed to stabilize your son's oxygen saturation levels using high-flow specialized therapies. The acute respiratory crisis has passed, but David will need to remain under our direct clinical care for at least 7 consecutive days to ensure the underlying bacterial infection is entirely eradicated from his pulmonary system." Evelyn let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief, falling back into the chair as Michael and Sarah cheered softly through their tears. Richard stepped forward, extending his hand to the physician. "Doctor, I want this child moved to a private recovery suite immediately. Ensure he has around-the-clock nursing supervision and bill every single procedure, medication, and amenity directly to my private corporate account. Money is absolutely no object." The doctor nodded respectfully, noting the high-status identification cards on the desk before turning back to Evelyn with a serious look. "While the immediate danger has been mitigated, Mrs. Morris, I must be completely honest with you about his long-term prognosis," the physician stated carefully. "David's lungs have suffered significant environmental degradation due to chronic exposure to toxic dampness and black mold spore structures. If he returns to the living conditions that precipitated this crisis, his pulmonary tissue will suffer irreversible damage, and the next episode could easily be fatal. He absolutely must live in a climate-controlled, dry, and sterile environment from this day forward." There can be no compromise on this point. The heavy silence returned to the room as Evelyn looked down at her hands, the harsh reality of her situations settling back over her shoulders like a lead weight. She knew the abandoned mill was a breeding ground for the very mold the doctor was describing, but she had absolutely no alternative options within her current financial reach. Richard stepped into the void immediately, his voice ringing out with an absolute unyielding clarity. He will not be returning to that environment, Doctor. Within 48 hours, this family will be placed in a premium, custom-selected residential estate that meets every single medical specification you have just outlined. I personally guarantee it. Evelyn turned to Richard, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and deep apprehension. Mr. Valmont, I cannot accept a gift of that magnitude from you. It is far too much, and I have no way of ever returning that kind of capital to your firm. I am an employee, not a charity case. Richard knelt down before her, looking directly into her eyes with an expression of profound humility. This is not charity, Evelyn. This is a very late, very small payment on a debt of justice that my company has owed your family for 4 long years. Your husband lost his life building my empire, and tonight your family saved my soul. Let me do what is right. 3 days later, the bright afternoon sun illuminated a beautiful, newly constructed 2-story craftsman home located in the quiet, tree-lined residential community of Bellevue, Washington. The air here was crisp, clean, and completely free of the industrial soot and harbor dampness that plagued the lower city districts. Richard stood on the manicured front lawn, holding a heavy iron key ring in his right hand as a local transport vehicle pulled up to the curb. Evelyn stepped out of the car first, carrying young David in her arms, who was wrapped in a brand-new wool blanket, his eyes bright in curiosity, returning to his face. Michael and Sarah followed closely behind, staring at the suburban landscape in absolute disbelief. "Welcome to your new home," Richard said, walking forward with a warm, genuine smile that felt entirely natural on his face for the first time in decades. He handed the keys directly to Michael, allowing the young teenager to be the one to unlock the front door for his family. As the heavy wooden door swung open, the family stepped into a vast, sun-drenched living room featuring high ceilings, a functional stone fireplace, and brand-new oak hardwood flooring that carried the clean scent of fresh pine. The home had been fully retrofitted with high-end industrial-grade air purification units and an advanced central heating system designed specifically to prevent any accumulation of humidity or mold. Sarah ran across the room, her small bare feet sliding across the clean wood as she looked at the beautiful furniture, the soft plush carpets, and the large television monitor mounted on the wall. "Mom, look! There's a giant kitchen with a real refrigerator full of food," she shouted, her voice echoing happily through the spacious layout. Michael walked upstairs, finding 4 large bedrooms, each fully furnished with comfortable beds, studying desks, and large windows that overlooked a secure, fenced backyard complete with a beautiful wooden swing set built into a massive oak tree. Evelyn walked slowly through the master bedroom, touching the high thread count sheets and looking out at the clean suburban sky, her shoulders finally dropping as the constant, chronic survival anxiety that had defined her existence for 4 years began to melt away. She walked back down the staircase to find Richard standing quietly by the front entrance, watching her children explore their new reality with a look of pure fulfillment that no corporate merger had ever provided him. "I don't know how to exist in a place like this, Mr. Valmont," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It feels like a dream that will vanish the moment I close my eyes." "It is real, Evelyn," Richard replied, his voice filled with an earnest devotion. "The deed to this property has been officially registered under your legal name, completely paid in full. There is no mortgage, no rent, and no hidden corporate strings attached. Furthermore, your position at Valmont Industries has been elevated to Chief Health and Safety Consultant for our active development divisions, featuring a compensation package that ensures your children will never have to worry about educational or medical expenses ever again. You are no longer cleaning my office. You are helping me run a company that protects its workers." The first formal dinner gathering between the Valmont and Morris families took place a week after the move, serving as a profound bridge between two entirely different social realities that had been brought together, tragedy and redemption. Richard arrived at the Bellevue residence at 6 o'clock in the evening, accompanied by his two teenage children, Sebastian and Valeria, who had spent their entire lives surrounded by insulated wealth, completely unaware of the struggles that existed beyond their elite private school circles. Richard had spent the previous weekend having the most intensely honest conversations of his life with his children, confessing the systemic corporate mistakes of his past and explaining how a night cleaner had taught him the true definition of a father's responsibility. Evelyn welcomed them into the home with a radiant warmth, her kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aromas of a classic home-cooked pot roast and freshly baked bread. A meal prepared with a profound sense of pride and celebration. Sebastian and Valeria, initially stiff and uncertain of how to behave in an environment where there were no catering staff or formal rules, found themselves pulled into the family dynamic by Michael, who immediately asked Sebastian for help carrying the heavy serving platters to the large dining table. "In this house, everyone works together to make the magic happen," Michael said with a confident, welcoming grin that instantly broke the ice between the two teenagers. As they sat down around the large wooden table, Evelyn lit a single, thick white wax candle placed in the center of the sprisade, her children immediately growing quiet and respectful as they looked at the flame. "Before we eat, we always practice our family tradition," Evelyn explained to the Valmont children with a gentle smile. "Each person must share one beautiful thing that occurred during their day, followed by one specific element for which they feel a deep sense of gratitude. David, since you are the youngest spirit among us, you have the honor of starting the circle." The small 5-year-old boy clapped his hands together, his cheeks rosy and full of life. "Something beautiful that happened today was that I got to climb all the way to the top of the backyard swing set without coughing once," he proudly announced. "And I am incredibly grateful for this big warm house, because my feet don't feel like ice cubes when I wake up in the morning." The profound simplicity of the child's statement caused a sudden, quiet hush to fall over the table, with Sebastian and Valeria looking down at their plates as a wave of deep perspective washed over their privileged minds. They had spent their lives complaining about minor inconveniences, yet here was a child expressing pure gratitude for warm feet and clear lungs. "My turn," Sarah announced happily. "Something beautiful was seeing a blue jay bird build a nest in our big oak tree outside my bedroom window. And I am grateful for my new books because they have pictures of castles that I can look at whenever I want to dream." Michael went next, his tone more grounded but deeply moving. "Something beautiful was seeing my mom smile while she was cooking today. Really smile, without looking tired. And I am grateful to Mr. Valmont for giving me a quiet desk where I can complete my honors algebra assignments without having to hold a flashlight in the dark." The focus of the table shifted toward the Valmont family, with Richard looking at his children, encouraging them to participate in a ritual that required looking inward rather than outward at material possessions. Valeria cleared her throat, her voice softening as she looked across at Sarah. "Something beautiful for me was walking into this house tonight and feeling a type of warmth that we don't have in our big mansion downtown," she admitted with stunning honesty. "And I am deeply grateful for this family because you are showing my brother and me what it truly means to look out for one another every single day." Sebastian nodded in agreement with his sister. Something beautiful was talking to Michael about his school goals and realizing how much harder he works than I do with half the resources, he said with genuine humility. "And I am profoundly grateful that my dad is changing the way he looks at the world, because it means we are finally becoming a real family instead of just a corporate business unit." Richard wiped a tear from his eye, reaching out to grip his son's hand tightly across the table. "Something beautiful for me is sitting here tonight watching my children discover their true hearts," Richard said, his voice breaking with immense pride. "And I am eternally grateful to Evelyn for having the grace to forgive my past blind arrogance and allowing me the chance to become a man my children can actually look up to." Following the completion of the meal, the children gathered in the living room round the fireplace, Where Michael and Sarah began to demonstrate the elaborate narrative games, there, Father Arthur used to invent for them using nothing but simple hand shadows against the wall. Sebastian and Valeria joined in, laughing and using their own hands to create elaborate creatures and heroes, completely forgetting their digital devices as they discovered the pure joy of shared human imagination. Richard sat with Evelyn at the kitchen counter, watching the beautiful scene unfold through the open doorway, his heart feeling fuller than it ever had during his decades of corporate success. "Arthur would be incredibly proud of the work you are doing with our safety divisions, Richard," Evelyn said quietly, using his first name for the very first time, as she looked at the official corporate safety manuals laid out on the counter. During the past week, Richard had officially established the Arthur Morris Memorial Safety Endowment, implementing the most rigorous, zero-tolerance industrial labor protection standards across every single construction site in the state of Washington, ensuring that no worker would ever be placed in danger for the sake of corporate profit margins again. "The honor is entirely mine, Evelyn," Richard replied, looking back at the children laughing around the fire. "Your family has given me a gift that money could never purchase. You taught me that the true measure of a person's life is not found in the height of the skyscrapers they build, or the size of their financial portfolio, but in the depth of the security, love, and presence they provide to the souls entrusted to their care. Arthur's physical life was cut short by corporate greed, but through your endurance and his values, his legacy has rewritten the future of my family and thousands of workers who will return home safely to their children every single night. The path of our later years often grants us a quiet vantage point from which to look back upon the long, winding road of our choices, and it is within that retrospective stillness that we discover the truest, most enduring laws of human existence. For so much of our youth and middle years, the world whispers a continuous, deceptive narrative into our ears. That security is a physical structure built of brick, mortar, and financial accumulation, and that our worth is measured by the tangible assets we manage to secure within our personal storehouses. We spend our precious days climbing corporate ladders, managing accounts, and safeguarding our fortunes against hypothetical storms, entirely unaware that the most dangerous rot does not occur in our balance sheets, but within the silent, unexamined spaces of our human hearts. It is a profound, sobering truth that a person can possess the highest tower in the city, controlling the livelihoods of thousands of souls from an insulated office of mahogany and glass, and yet remain an absolute pauper in the currency of empathy, connection, and spiritual peace. True prosperity is never a solitary achievement. It is an interconnected ecosystem of responsibility, a sacred understanding that our abundance has no moral validity unless it is used to lift the vulnerabilities of those who stand beside us in the labor of life. When we allow the pursuit of profit or the fear of scarcity to blind us to the human cost of our ambitions, we are not merely committing an error of business. We are fracturing the foundational covenant that binds us to one another as children of the same creation. To look upon a fellow human being who labors in our service, who cleans our spaces, built our foundations, or delivered our goods, and to see them merely as a line item on an expense report is a profound failure of the soul, an ignorance that eventually returns to demand a devastating spiritual reckoning. The world does not remember us for the wealth we hoarded, but for the safety we created for others, the dignity we restored to the broken, and the grace with which we acknowledged our own profound mistakes. It takes an immense, courageous humility to look into the mirror of our life and admit that our success was built upon the uncompensated sacrifices of those who had no voice to protest our neglect. Yet, it is precisely within that painful moment of absolute corporate confession that our true redemption begins, transforming our wealth from a heavy, suffocating armor into a powerful instrument of justice, mercy, and enduring love. Furthermore, we must always remember that the deepest, most permanent treasures of a family are never found in the material luxuries we provide to our children, but in the absolute quality of our presence, our shared imagination, and the strength of our moral integrity during the darkest hours of adversity. A house with many rooms and central heating is a beautiful blessing for a sick child. But if that structure is devoid of parental time, deep embraces, and stories told from the depths of a loving heart, it remains nothing more than a magnificent, freezing museum of material success. The children of our world do not thrive on the abstract security of our bank accounts. They grow strong on the consistency of our presence, the laughter shared across simple dinner tables, and the knowledge that their parents value their hearts, far above any corporate achievement or public status. When we invest our limited time and creative energy into building a sanctuary of love, resilience, and mutual respect within our households, we are constructing a legacy that entirely transcends the physical reality of our mortality, creating a beautiful, generational echo of goodness that will continue to guide our descendants long after our names have faded from the active memory of the world. In the final assessment of our lives, when the noise of the marketplace falls completely silent and the accumulation of our earthly labor is stripped away down to its absolute core, we will find that the only things we truly get to keep are the pieces of love we gave away to others. The tragedy of loss and the reality of poverty are immense, heavy burdens that can break the physical body, but they possess absolutely no power to destroy the eternal spirit of a family that chooses to face the storm with an unyielding devotion to honesty, integrity, and mutual protection. Let us therefore live our remaining days with our eyes wide open to the silent struggles occurring beneath our own roofs and within our own communities, ever ready to lay down our corporate pride, to listen to the untold stories of the vulnerable, and to transform our personal privileges into a warm, safe harbor for those who have been forgotten by the world. For it is only through this continuous, beautiful exchange of forgiveness, accountability, and unconditional love that we can truly heal the deep wounds of our corporate structures, elevate the memory of those who have left us too soon, and ensure that our existence leaves the world a place of greater light, warmth, and enduring human dignity for all the generations yet to come.